Hello. Hello, good evening, good afternoon, good morning from wherever you're getting and joining us. I'm Anupama Jain. I'm an author, a community builder, a mentor, and a creative writing consultant. With me, I have Atima, I have Anita, I have Debapriya. And today we will be talking about the language of belonging and how preserving of cultural heterogeneity builds global empathy. Before I shoot my first question across to my esteemed panelists, I would like them to quickly introduce themselves so that we can go ahead. Anita, Atima, then Debapriya. I think we should go in that order.
Right. So I'm Anupama already said, Anita Sharma. I'm a published author, thanks to Readermania. And I'm also a bilingual poet. I do poetry both in English and Hindi. I've been an educator for about 27 plus years, and I quit it voluntarily because I wanted to pursue my interest in writing. That's it, Anupama.
Hi,
Hi.
Atima. Would you like to say a couple of words about your
Yeah,
work?
Hi, I'm Atima Mankotia. I have published 3 books with Readomania. All are fiction, and they are women-centric books. I used to be in the media for 35 years, and then I moved out and joined the United Nations. And when I retired from there, now I'm working as a professor in a business school. And I love to write, I love to read, and I hope my next book is going to be received well.
All the best.
Debapriya?
Hi, Anupama. Thank you so much. And lovely to meet Anita and Atima. So, I'm Debapriya Ghosh, and I've published with Readomania twice. So, my first book was published in 2023. It was a women centric fictional novel called And You Think I Don't Know. And my second book, The World of Tagore, was a translation of 10 of Tagore's best known short stories. My third book is coming up very soon with Readomania, and it's on Swami Vivekananda and seen from a little different and more modern point of view. So that's it.
So, all of you who are listening in to us, you see that we have such a stellar panel, such highly accomplished women. So, it's such a pleasure to be moderating this session. Though, without much ado, my first question to Anita. Language is often described as a bridge, but before it becomes bridge, isn't it first a home? What does belonging mean to you in the language you think, dream, or grieve in?
Okay, thank you for your question, Anupama. And before I launch into my answer, I would like to thank Ananke and Readomania for giving us this lovely platform for a very interesting discussion. So, talking about language, definitely without any disagreement, it is the most powerful instrument in our hands. And like you rightly pointed out, it is a home, it's a safe house, it archives, it preserves culture, and it passes it down to posterity. And at the same time, it is not just one bridge, but I feel it is multiple bridges which connect all these houses, all these safe houses. Some of these languages, yes, definitely move on to become the lingua franca because they are more commonly spoken, more commonly read. So, definitely, language is a home and a bridge. For the second part of your question, what does belonging mean to me? Uh, I think belonging I would define it as something which is a very intrinsic and indivisible part of me. You know, I had read somewhere that if you want to know what is a person's mother tongue, his native language, wake him up from deep slumber, suddenly. And the first word he says, you'll know what is the language he prefers. I don't think that will hold true in my case because I am equally comfortable with both English and Hindi. So I think I grieve And I also celebrate equally in both languages.
Such a lovely answer, truly, and it was so wonderful that to hear that you managed to. I mean, you are adept at writing poetry in both English and Hindi. That's such a wonderful trait, actually.
Thank you.
Atima, again, once again, heartiest congratulations. Holding a book, a new printed. When you see those words that you have slogged over on a paper on your long hand, or on your monitor, suddenly taking book form. That's a joy. That's second to none, truly. So heartiest congratulations once again to you.
You.
When we talk about the language of belonging, whose belonging are we centering? The readers, the writers, or the culture being represented? Can all three be served at once?
Well, I would like to say that, all the three are not really competing with each other. I would like to look at all these three as, three people sitting at a dining table. If there's one voice which is dominating, then it's a loss for everybody. But if all the voices are equally heard and they are contributing equally, then obviously it gives us a richer experience. If you look at how we've grown up reading Enid Blyton. We've gone into a culture which was completely alien. We've looked at boarding house culture. We've looked at countryside that is unfamiliar, scones and jam which we've never heard about, tongue sandwiches, things that we don't know. But we were very happily going into that. The she did not, Enid Blyton did not try to dilute her culture, but she invited us in and we discovered a lot of new things. Similar with P.G. Woodhouse, he never apologized for his setting. It was totally British, Edwardian British, but his books are very delightful and he trusts the audience enough to walk into his book and understand it, and he expects the readers to be intelligent. So I would think that literature is any reader, writer, or culture. For a writer, the culture is not really the backdrop in which the story is told. The culture, it is one of the main protagonists, and the fact is that the writer has to write with truthfulness, authenticity, and then the it's a very delightful part that the reader plays. uh, he or she, the reader, walks into the book or goes into the book talking about not having any expectations of familiarity, but with expectations of discovering something new. So I think all the three can be, very, they work together very well rather than competing with each other.
At this point, I just want to add a little anecdote, that happened. I also, for my fancy bread and butter, I also moonlight as a mentor to senior classes. So one of the in for 12th grade, the first lesson is called, ironically, the last lesson. It's about how the French have lost the this thing to the control over the language, because Germany is overtaking, and then German will be taught in the schools henceforth. So somebody very, observes, like, very observes very keenly. Oh, are they going to make the pigeons also go in German now? And I think at that point it was just a line to be read, but then that just sits in your head that language is someone's such a, it's like something that you grow up with, that is your calling card, to say the, to put it in a different way. So coming back to Deva Priya, we often say language is a tool for communication, but it is the very bedrock of cultural selfhood. Could you share a specific untranslatable word from your region, or an idiom from your regional identity that perfectly encapsulate the way of belonging that a generic global English word misses?
Yes, Anupama, that's a very nice question, because there's this word, Abhiman.
Yeah.
in Bengali and in Hindi, right? So I've searched for it everywhere, but I haven't really got something, even remotely akin to Abhiman in any of the other languages. I think, it's because we Indians are emotional or sensitive in a certain way, perhaps a little more than other races. So, for us, what is Abhiman? You can't really imagine a British person being deeply drowning in Abhiman. I mean, that's the way I look
Self-pride
at it.
doesn't have it. Self-pride doesn't even encapsulate the entire, ethos that, or the nuance that comes with it.
Absolutely. And, since you mentioned anecdotes, there's this very funny proverb that we have in Bengali. So I'll say it in Bengali. Anita, Atima, just excuse me, I'll explain it to you and for the benefit of the other audience. It's called খুকি রাতে শিখেনি শুক্তোতে ঝাল দিয়েছে অম্বলেতে ঘি. Okay, so Kuki means a very young girl, a little girl. Ratte Shekheni means she hasn't learned to cook yet. So Shukto is a lovely vegetable that Bengalis begin the meal with. It's very tasty, but it's bland, you know. So she has put jhal, which is chilies. She's put chilies in the shukto, and ombol is the chutney. She's put ghee in the chutney.
Oh, she's
She's made a mess of it. So, I cannot imagine this being translated. Okay, you can translate it literally, but you won't get the fun.
I understand.
If like you kind of laugh at it because we are taking the shukto is what we begin the meal with, and ombol, the chutney is the one that we end the meal with. So from beginning to end, she's made a mess of it, and there's a little story in that, and which comes out in best in our
Your
language,
own. Okay. Yes.
your own language.
So that is the same problem that I faced, when I was writing the Gita. In second chapter, especially Krishna explains about being sthita prajna, or someone who has to follow what is one's swadharma. The closest is swadharma is your own innate nature. Innate nature doesn't quite become swadharma. Swadharma is like a entire ocean, and sthita pragnata, the closest word is equanimity. Again, that kind of doesn't cut. So I think there are some things that our native language only works best, I guess. Coming
Absolutely.
back to Anita, where when a writer chooses to write in a regional language or a dialect rather than a dominant global language, is it a choice that is inherently a political act of preservation, or simply it is to accurately map their internal landscape? Is it a limitation? Because I think this is makes more sense to ask you this, because you're so equally adept at both Hindi and English. So you can think at ease with both. So naturally, rather.
Okay. So, Anupama, I'll answer the second part of your question first. Is it a limitation? And definitely, it is not a limitation. I'm not speaking just from my own viewpoint. Let's take a look at generally books across the world. We had 100 Years of Solitude, which was written in Spanish. We had Anna Karenina, which was written in Russian. We had Diary of a Young Girl, which was written in Dutch. Then we had Amrita Pritham writing in Punjabi, Pinjar. And these are all works which have been read, I think, by most people. So I don't think writing in their regional languages limited them in any way. And if you talk of Harivansh Rai Bachchan, he had a PhD from Cambridge. But when he wrote his Madhushala, he wrote it in Hindi. So language, I don't think becomes a limitation. It is a matter of choice. And now coming back to the first part of your question, that is it an act of political act of preservation? First and foremost, writing is totally apolitical. Now, uh, that's what I believe in. And you have given me, two extremes. One is that people write it because they want to preserve their regional culture, and the other is they want to write in a particular minority language just because that is what they express themselves best in. But between these two extremes, there are so many other things also. Like, all these writers can be motivated by different things. And I personally feel that the ones at the extremes are few, and majority of the writers choose the language because it is the language of convenience and it is the language of comfort. It is a language which gives them the greatest freedom to express themselves. So that is what I feel primarily promotes the choice of a language. And
I am a
not the
I'm so
only
sorry.
way, but the best way of expressing yourself. So that is the language you will choose.
So I am a Telugu. I can read and write my mother tongue very well. Often my family has wondered why, I haven't, and I'm married into a North Indian family. So now I'm beginning to think in Hindi as well. But I think English is the first language where the thoughts are easier to express, I guess. So, but I must make amends and start writing in Telugu as well now. Atima, this is for you. How do we prevent the language of belonging from becoming a language of exclusion? Can literature use deep, hyperlocal language identity to invite outsiders in rather than shut them out?
Well, I think what we need to do is the language. As I said, if we look at some of the larger, the bigger authors, somebody like a Tagore, Tolstoy, even Jane Austen, they don't interrupt their writings to explain what is their social, to explain all the social norms that are not the readers might not be familiar with. They just again try to explain that they try to create the authentic religion, their regionalism. They stick to the authenticity of their region. So I think there are a lot of words that and dialects and things that are not really translatable. But what we can do is we don't have to dilute them. There are times we should take a decision that we should either not. The importance is which are the words that we do not want to translate. That is where the importance comes in. There are a lot of things that we do not that do not that are not transferable, as Depriya was saying. So I think when we are writing, we need to look at uh, the idea of language. It's not like a tourist guide explaining to you before the journey has begun, but it's like a local friend who takes you around, explains a few things. Some things you discover on your own, and others remain like a mystery. So that's where the pleasure is. And the language is not about converting words into another language. It's like a whole ecosystem of emotions that we carry from one culture to the other. So we need to remain true to the culture and the authenticity. I don't think any one language can own the whole map of human emotions. I think every language illuminates a little corner of human emotions, and that is what we should be doing as writers.
Wonderfully said. Very, very wonderfully said. Coming back to Devapriya, a translator doesn't merely carry across languages. They carry history, humor, silence, even prejudice. Where does one draw the line, making a text accessible and protecting its cultural identity? Because you have written about, you have translated Tagore's stories, and you're coming out with your third book, which is also who is also writing about a global icon. So all the more reason that we should hear more about this from you.
Yes, Anupama, thank you so much for letting me talk about this. You're giving me this opportunity on this platform. So thank you for that. When I was asked to translate Tagore, now, yeah, I mean, there are all these emotions that you spoke about. There is prejudice, there is humor, there's all kinds of emotions, and I knew that if I um, went beyond, I became too eager or enthusiastic to make it too global, too acceptable to the global audience, there could be backlash from the conservatives back home. So here, you're treading on very unsure grounds, because you don't know how acceptable that's going to be. Because Tagore is an ocean, Swamiji is an ocean. Okay, they are mountains of men, right? So, but see, the author also has to come to a middle point somewhere. So for me, I mean, the what I sort of thought that let me just follow my own formula, because after all, I'm also an author, I'm a reader. I did not look at myself as an Indian or someone who thinks and writes only in English. I thought of myself as a human being. I said that I have to address human nature. So, what are the things that I can make relatable? Right. I mean, in the 10 stories that we selected ultimately, see, there's Kabuliwala, where the Kabuliwala has left behind his little daughter in
Afghanistan.
Afghanistan, and he misses his little daughter and he finds his daughter in Mini. I mean, there, no matter what language you use, see, the emotion is so global, it's so universal that you are just sort of writing it in English, and you're giving that story to readers who are parents or children who identify with the Kabuliwala as a parent, or the children will probably identify with the child in it. So just like that, in all the 10 stories, and even in Swamiji, what I have tried to do is, as I said, that I've tried to make it more contemporary, more modern, because here we are addressing Gen Z. We know that they are a generation, I mean, who really know what to expect when they are buying a book off the shelf.
True.
Right. So I have to give them something that holds their attention, number one. And number two, it's very important for me to give them a message. Because one thing that this generation has proved to all of us in India is that they are really capable of carrying forward their voice.
Mm.
So today, my voice as an author of Vivekananda needs to be translated into their voice so that they can take it forward. Because my time will draw to a close, and now this generation, it'll be on them. Right. So I think it's more of a transfer of ideas, your ideology and your message to the next generation, and give them very, very common things to relate to, like, the emotions that are more universal.
Excellently said. At this point, I would like to request all your indulgence here. So, what you said reminds me of this book. This is most of us, when we talk about the epics of India, we are very, the first thing that we say is, okay, there's the Ramayana. The Ramayana is much in news now, Ramayana or the Mahabharata, but beyond these two, there is a classic that is much older, that has stories of both these, called the Katha Sarita Sagara, the stream of ocean of stories. So this was the first book I wrote for children. So I had to now. I mean, it has got thousands of stories. So out of which I had to select the stories that have stood, that are reflective of time-tested values like anger or emotions, because they transcend generations. These values are what they drive. And also what I had tried to do was, I mean, in those ages, women weren't agentic. Women weren't given the choice of, I mean, when I say give itself, that is so obvious. But so I tried to make the women more agentic in my stories. I think I pulled off the this thing, because a curated collection of that became a supplementary read in leading schools in India. But it was, as you said, Devapriya, it's a difficult task, because you're walking on a very thin ice. You either you go too, in today's language, you upset the purists. But if you stay too rigid with language, you don't appeal to the youngsters. So it's a very, very thin rope
Nice
to
you're
walk
skating
on.
on.
Yeah. Yes, as you said, wonderfully. So that brings me back to Anita then. Where were we? Yeah. We, sorry, apologies. We often celebrate diversity, yet global publishing rewards stories that travel across cultures. Do we sometimes unconsciously edit out cultural specificity in pursuit of universality?
Okay. So, global stories travel
This is
because of
this. Sorry to interrupt. I think this is in tune with your second book that has just come out.
the Lost Ashoka Cipher. It's a historical
Yes.
fiction. Yes.
Yeah.
So I feel global stories travel because of their individuality and not in spite of it. And publishers, good publishers who are in this field for the love of books, will always promote ethnic, authentic voices. And since you mentioned my book, Readomania, we have, and they bring out selective titles, limited titles every year, but they have a very strong stamp of Indian culture and specifically even regional culture. My book, since you mentioned it, The Lost Ashoka Cipher, is purely in an Indian context. And I have used a lot of terms which are even from Sanskrit, because I've been writing about manuscripts which are ages and ages old. So imagine if there are manuscripts which were written in Sanskrit in 1500 BC, and if I call them, the nine of them, nine manuscripts, and if I call them book one, book two, book three, it just wouldn't make sense. So I've used the Sanskrit numbering of Ekam and Navam and Pancham. And I'm sure readers will be able to relate to it quite easily. It doesn't take so much effort, and I think. Discerning readers are intelligent enough to be able to connect the dots and understand what is written in a different cultural ethos. So that is that's the first part of your question. And the second was, do we unconsciously edit something which is very indigenous? I think any writer who writes because he's got that fire in his belly or he's passionate about writing, he will not consciously or unconsciously compromise on the backdrop or the essence or the context of his story. I'll give you an example of Munshi Premchand. No, not Munshi Premchand. Mulk Rajanand.
Yeah.
He wrote Untouchables in 1935. In 1935, India did not have very many readers who would read books in English. So it was for primarily a English reading audience, for the consumption of English readers. Yet he stuck to the caste system, which is exclusive for India. And he even used, terms like jalebi and Gora Sahibs and Miyaji, those terms which probably a Britisher would not be able to connect with. But he did not compromise on that. So I feel that any writer worth his salt will not make those kind of adjustments.
I think R.K. Narayan is another great example.
Yes,
It's like
yes,
the South Indian ethos seeps out of his language, though it is written in entirely in English.
very true.
Okay, Atima, cultural heterogeneity sounds like a value everyone agrees upon in principle. Where does it exactly get tested? Is it in publishing decisions or translation choices? What gets untranslated?
Well, if you look at it, I don't think publicly anybody is going to talk against, heterogeneity, cultural heterogeneity. Everybody, whether it's a translator, whether it's a publisher, whether it's a writer, they'll all see a lot of value in it. I think the challenge comes uh, that do we have the courage to uh, do it still when it becomes inconvenient? So are we merely looking at making it global, or are we making it universal? And the universal doesn't mean that it has to be same. It's a book or a fiction or a story that is rooted in one place, but it travels well across across nations, across cultures, and that is what actual heterogeneity is. And the real challenge is not in these large, declarations that we talk about, but it's actually the small silent decisions that we do before the book actually reaches the readers. Do we soften a particular dialect? Do we keep this word the way it is, or should we uh, put in an equivalent in English? So those are the decisions that get taken. I think that is where the challenge is. And I think my forthcoming book, I kind of had that kind of a little bit of a challenge. My book is called All That She Left Behind. It's a psychological thriller. Most of it is based in Atrauli. It's a semi-urban place in Uttar Pradesh, and Kannauj. So a large part of the plot is there. I belong in the sense I haven't really stayed in Atrauli, but my ancestors belong there, so I'm familiar with the culture. So I and it's something that it's a book that spans three eras as well as three generations of women. So I have tried to keep the book very authentic to the culture of the region in terms of how they address each other, in terms of food, culture, the architecture, everything. So many times I thought that should I, instead of saying Jiji and Jijaji, should I say brother-in-law? I mean, that just doesn't sound the same. You can't say brother-in-law. And for Nani, there is no equivalent in English. I mean, you can't say maternal grandmother and paternal grandmother. There's no Nani and Mosi and those kind of things. So Panditji, so I have decided that I will keep those kind of words the way it is, and I hope that after people finish reading the book, they do not feel that they have read a book which is could be generic in any part of India. I wanted them to experience that what are the three eras, the language that should talk about the three eras, the different regions, whether it's Kannauj, whether it's Atrauli, and it's based in Bombay. How the modern women are very different. Their language is very different from pre-independence India. So I have tried to do that. Of course, there are challenges, but as I said, the challenges get taken. The challenges are before the book reaches the readers, and I think we need to have the courage and the conviction that uh, we want to retain the dialect and the cultural authenticity.
I think your reader mania
Anupama,
has
can
been
I
very
just
brave here. Yes, yes, please. I'm just saying, I mean, I'm just listening to all your words, and I think your reader mania has been very brave. He's putting literally walking the talk. Yes, Anita, please tell.
actually, Atima just, struck a chord when she talked about the words like Panditji and Jijaji. So I was just thinking, like a movie like Chak De. So imagine translating it into English and say raise up or lift up. It just wouldn't make sense.
It
Chakde
doesn't.
is chakde. So there are some words you cannot, just meddle with. It's best to leave them alone.
Absolutely.
Good.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Okay, Devapriya. We talk about safeguarding without diluting. Can you give a concrete example from your work where you had to choose fidelity to the original and accessibility for a new audience? I mean, pretty much all of us have dealt with that challenge.
Yes, yes, Anupama, there is this story in Tagore that I translated. It's called Ginni, which translates to the lady of the house. Okay,
Ginny.
Ginni. Ginni
Oh,
actually means the lady
coin.
of the house is, Malkin, as we say.
Ah.
Okay, so the mistress of the house. So here, actually, the story was about.
Just pardon me for interrupting. This is for Anita and Atima, but in Guinea, North means it's a coin, isn't it? That you give in a marriage
That
or
is what,
any auspicious
yes.
Yes.
In
occasion.
North India, it does.
Sone
The
ki
gold
giddy.
coin. It's a gold coin. A guinea, but it's an English word actually. If you look at it, yeah, it's a guinea is an English word which has been
Guinea.
adapted in India.
All
Yeah.
right.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. 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 So but Tagore being Tagore, and he had a very modern voice for his times. So over here, Ginni, meaning the mistress of the house, actually the story was about a little boy.
Okay.
All right, and he loved to play with dolls. He had a little sister, and whenever they had some time to themselves and they were playing, they would play with the sister's toys, the dolls. So, otherwise, his child was very shy, and in school, he would always be picked upon by this very rigid, um, teacher who was a pandit. And one day, it was raining, and the pandit came and took shelter right in front of their house, the gate, and he saw the boy playing with dolls. And the next day, he goes back to school and he makes a very big joke, a nasty joke about it. Now, over here, what Tagore really wants to tell us is that it is okay to break gender stereotypes. There was a very underlying message that the boy was effeminate. And probably as the years would pass on, he would show more, you know, visible features of it. So over here, Nupama, I wouldn't really say language had much to do about it. But keeping in today's times, today we are much more vocal about these topics. So I wanted to give the audience a clearer picture, you know, that look, this is what the story is about. So this is exactly what I want you, whether you're a child or an adult, to interpret. That this story is about, a boy who identifies more with his feminine part, and this teacher is purposely trying to be nasty with him because the problem lies with him, not with the child.
Very, very sad.
So here I wouldn't really compromise on the child's character at all. Instead, I just wanted readers to hate the teacher, and I thought that this was something that was so global,
Hmm.
where I wouldn't really have to compromise on the language, the literary part of it at all. All
Okay.
right. But, try to tell students and teachers who were going to read the book that you see, as a teacher, Anupama, you would be knowing, you must have identified so many such little children in your teaching career. I think, Anita, you've also been a teacher, right? And we teachers have to deal with these things in very sensitive way. So I did receive a feedback from one of my ex-students, his mother, saying that she was glad, to read what I had written, the style of writing, even
Sensitively sculpted story.
sensitively handled.
Only yesterday I was teaching that the first poetry, that serious poetry, that children get, the daffodils. So 10,000 danced it, and then one couldn't be, a jocund, but in such gay company. So the words, the way we have used have changed, and that girl, the expression she had, what exactly is my madam trying to tell me here? So then you had to tell the origin of the word and how the perception has changed. And also, like the same challenge that you have all faced. I mean, these are the ones. This is about a Telugu girl like me that comes to the big bad world and undergoes all transformation. So, like for instance, I couldn't have used, as Atima said, I had to call the father Nana. She will not say dad or something. It doesn't make sense. Amma. Then, and all the, then there is, we are all tied. Food is the only religion as far as I'm concerned. So this thing that she, if I call a brinjal chutney, or it doesn't make the same thing. So I had to use wankaya pachadi because chutney is pachadi. So these are the things. But if you don't stick to English, it kind of reduces the nuance, I feel. So same challenges as both Atima and Anita have faced, but it has gone off well by God's grace. So Anita, coming back to you, uh, the world of AI. AI and machine translation are making languages more accessible than ever before. Do these technologies strengthen cultural exchange, or they risk ironing out precisely those nuances that make cultures distinct?
Okay. So AI and ChatGPT and all these technologies which have, made a big boom. Uh, I feel that there is a huge chasm between language which is inherent and which has been evolved painstakingly over the years, and something which comes out of a machine. Because what comes from a machine is going to be mechanical. It's like, that nicely brewed coffee and instant coffee. So that difference is always going to be there. And I feel that even if you are taking assistance from one of these digital platforms, you have to be adept at both languages. It cannot be that, I write in Hindi and English, but I want to use French words. So I just go and I type and I get French words, because the context will not be there. It's something like, Chatur and Three Idiots and that famous speech of his. So unless you are totally familiar with both the languages, I don't think these technologies are going to help you. And technologies don't bridge cultures. Technologies are just tools. It is the people who are going to use them and manipulate them and handle them. They are the ones who are going to make a difference. They are the ones who are going to reach across cultures.
Very well. Very well put. Atima, what are your views on this question? Does global empathy actually require understanding differences in detail, or it can work through a kind of imaginative shortcut, feeling with someone without fully knowing their specifics?
I think empathy has two parts. First is the emotional empathy, and the second is intellectual empathy. Emotional empathy is something that we feel immediately, like a mother's grief, sorrow, love, loneliness, fear. Those are emotions that the human mind is geared for. But if we stop here, then we are confusing empathy with sympathy. It's not really that. What happens? The second is intellectual. When we understand the perspective, cannot just we are borrowing somebody's. We can borrow somebody's emotions, but here we are also borrowing somebody's perspective. For example, if we let me look at some of the books. For example, To Kill a Mockingbird. We
Hmm.
understand. It's a I was looking at a simple book which everybody would have read. So you understand the innocence of childhood. You understand justice, but to get the context is when you understand the racial history of Southern America. Same with Anne Frank's diary, while you understand the fear of a child, but till you understand the Holocaust and the Nazi Europe under the Nazi rule. That's the context. So it's a perspective. And AI, I mean, it's a communication is very different from understanding. It's not the same thing. Understanding, I think it's like a rebellion. Literature is like a rebellion against all these modern forms of communication, while AI is a good tool to for our research, for we can use it as a tool for research, for even editing, and it obviously reduces some of our labor. But I think literature actually talks, it allows us to linger. It says stop, linger, understand, and then move on. Whereas AI is just a fast, immediate, quick, it just throws information at you. It doesn't have a voice. So I think that is what my understanding is. And it's very important. I don't think AI has a voice, and I like to talk about my first book, which is Staring at the Square Moon. It basically deals with abuse. Mostly, it's as I said, I try and write women based fiction because that's something uh, I mean, I'm most familiar with. So we deal with, it deals with sexual abuse, it deals with physical abuse, it deals with emotional abuse. While abuse is a universal emotion which everybody understands, but at the same time, I have tried to put it in the context of India. While all the women here are modern urban Indian women, but still, if you look at from their perspective, it will be very different in a country like India, even if you are in a modern urban city. So again, it's the I have tried to put it in that context, and I hope people understand that in India, the way you react to abuse, the way your emotional journey is after abuse, your decisions might be different from another culture. So that is, I think, AI is something that uh, is not capable of doing these kind of things. We should not look at it as competition. We should look at it as a tool that can help us.
But AI is getting sentient very fast. I think days are not far when it's going to be like the recent controversy in the Commonwealth Prize. I mean, the way he had used Jamir Nazir, the similes that he had used, like comparing someone's early morning beauty to a wash basin, and then he had the controversy itself is so big. Imagine if it touches that level. Or even Persepolis, do we have to understand the culture or the way women lead their lives to empathize with what she went through, the protagonist here? Or was she playing to the Western tropes of how Arab women are supposed to be? Well, that's a matter for a discussion for another day, I guess. So, Deva Priya, sorry for that a little digression, but my coming back to you. There is a tendency in global publishing to treat cultural heterogeneity as an exotic commodity. How can writers and publishers ensure that celebrating specific cultural realities doesn't dissolve into performing authenticity for global gaze?
Yes, I I personally feel that it's very tough for an author in any part of the world to remain true to their own culture, and at the same time, pitch the book to a global audience. Obviously, the publisher will want a global audience. I mean, the writer herself would also appreciate that.
Yes.
But somewhere or the other, there is bound to be some sort of a dilution. I think it was not there earlier, maybe a 50 or 100 years ago. Like when we read Pearl Buck, when we read her, we actually liked what she wrote about. We liked the kind of descriptions of rural life and the people, their lives. It was something very exotic to us, right? And we've all read The Alchemist, right? All right, and The Alchemist, I think, is, why I'm mentioning The Alchemist is that there is a kind of cultural identity. At the same time, I mean, that book sort of, makes you turn a somersault and realize, oh my god, this is a book about one culture that's called humanity. Right, and that is how I feel the author should take herself to a level where she is addressing the human race as a whole. Right, because see, when we travel to exotic places all over the world, don't we? We travel to places we haven't been to soak in their culture. We are eating their food, which we don't get in India. We go sightseeing to different places that we don't get in our own country. So why can't we do it with books? We write in English, but we give them, the exotic things that they are looking for, and at the same time we give them a kind of universality. That's very difficult. It's easier said than done, right? But it's not impossible, and I think in days to come, I mean, the publishers all over the world will realize that today, with the younger generation being such an active part of movements all over the world, they are going to prefer content that will bridge the gap. So it's all about, I think, Anupama, it's all about bridging the gap, while at the same time I mean, when I read books like The White Tiger, Arvind Adiga, right? I really enjoyed the fact that he's created a protagonist, who is so gray and who is belongs to a certain part of India. His cultural identity is maintained over there in that book, right?
Right.
So Arundhati Roy, when she writes about her new book, Mother Mary Comes to Me, it's all about her childhood and her mother, and in a certain part of India. Ruskin Bond, for all his life, he's written about Dehradun and Missouri,
True.
and we all like it so much. Right. So even in our books, like, in your books, Anupama, you have also, like, the Gita. The language of Gita is a spiritual language. It's not about being in Hindi, English, Bangla, or any other language. It's a spiritual language, and you are addressing it to the mind of the audience, where language ultimately is not going to matter.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I mean, again, the Greek mythology is in latest news. No, Odyssey. This become this thing. So
Yes.
I was teaching. There is a poet from Scotland called Carol Ann Duffy, and she's written lovely poems on both Medusa and Penelope. So as part of 12th grade IB syllabus, so they read Penelope and Medusa. So, I mean, we've read them in a different way, and what she has interpreted, and what a young boy is looking at the women and understanding, oh, feminism works in this way also. So, it's again the subject has been the same, the story has been the same, the interpretation has changed across ages, and that's what makes it very current, very relevant, and very likable. So please do read her poems, Devapriya, if you get a chance. They're very simple, nothing
Sure.
very complicated, but the undercurrent is what is very, very attractive about it. Uh, Anita, I think we are about to reach the end of discussion, I think, but we have time to plug in a couple of more questions. I request you all to be a little faster. Uh, as writers, do we ever find yourself subconsciously explaining your culture for an international audience? If so, does that enrich your work or quietly change the voice in which it's written?
Okay, Anupama, I'll answer this in two parts. First is, do you explain yourself? And secondly, do you explain your culture?
Yes.
So, as an author, I deliberately, consciously steer away from over explanation because I feel that it's a murder of the narrative, frankly. Because too many explanations can ruin the story, and you have to respect the reader's intelligence that they can make out what is being conveyed without being written. Like when I wrote my novel prior to the historical fiction, The Dalhousie Murders, I had to be very careful about not going to too many details of what the inspector is doing and what the detective is doing and how they come to the conclusions, because you cannot,
I read
just
that.
put
I loved
everything
it.
on a plate and hand it over. You have to leave something to the thought process and the imagination of the reader. Coming to the second part, I've never had the opportunity of explaining my culture, but I would abstain from that as well. I'll give you a small example. Like, if I had to say, supposing my protagonist had to perform the last rites of his father. So, probably one sentence that he waded into the water and the sweat was glistening on his recently shaved head as he poured the ashes into the river would suffice. Rather than I say that, true to the Indian culture, he being the eldest son, had to get his head shaved, and then the next morning after the cremation, when the ashes had cooled down, he collected them, put them in an urn. It was tied with a red cloth, and then he took it to the river, and a sacred river close to his house, and there he gradually immersed the ash. So all that is not required. You don't need to give explanation of why he is doing and what he is doing. Just that one sentence would suffice. That is how I look at it.
By the way, I read her first book. It is a wonderful book. I loved it. So
Thank you so much.
So, Atima, last question to you. Regional identity is often strongest in language that resists standardization, dialects, idioms, oral traditions. Is there a tension in preserving the specificity and making literature exportable for global market?
I think the tension is there, but the tension is not between regional identity and global readership. I think the tension is more between authenticity and commercial anxiety. So the publishers often feel that unless the book is easily accepted, if it's immediately familiar, so those are the things that actually that's where the tension arises. But as we have been discussing throughout this, that some of the greatest books, authors, nobody has ever bothered to, nobody has ever actually done that to tone down or to sandpaper their culture and dilute the culture. The books that have done well and people remember are the books that actually talk about the differences, the diversity, and they draw the audience, the reader, into their culture. So I don't think that is the tension is not at all between that. The commercial anxieties are always there. Uh, those are things that publishers and maybe writers sometimes need to think about, and we need to have the courage. Uh, and if by exportable we mean that all the stories seem like they belong to one place, certainly not. But if we, when we are talking about exportable, if it means that the story travels while it retains its own fragrance to the place it belongs, then certainly it's actually very, that's something that we are looking at. So the stories need to be rooted in one place, and they should be traveling well. That is what I think exportable means. So
One.
I mean that's it. I mean, we'll keep it short as we are running out of time.
So, I mean, this is what even I've tried to do with Gita. I mean, this is something that there are millions of versions of Gita. So, what makes this a little different? I've tried to keep each chapter in conversation with world literature instance, like Arjuna Vishada, the conundrum of Arjun, whether he should fight his, elders, his gurus. The same thing as Hamlet dilemma, the dilemma of Hamlet, to be or not to be. So, and then as somebody has talked about, every chapter at the end, there is an instance. There is also the alchemist. Arjuna found the treasure on his chariot, on the floor of his chariot, and it was under the sycamore tree for the boy. Okay, last question to you, Devapriya. History shows that languages disappear not because they become irrelevant, but because of power shifts. So, is it a literary responsibility to preserve language or a political one now?
Anupama, definitely a literary responsibility. Because, see, I think Anita has already said that literature is apolitical. See, because we are authors, we are creative people, and creative people can never be a part of any destructive movement. We do know where politics come in, there's always destruction following behind. All right, and politics is divisive to a great extent. That
Very
is
nice.
how politics keeps itself alive. So,
Very. You say it's a literary one.
literature, yes, definitely, authors have this huge responsibility of, taking readers all across the world as little pearls and stringing them into a necklace. So, where each pearl is going to be different, each pearl is going to come from a different part of the world, but each pearl is going to be unique, you know. And the ultimate product is going to be a huge uh, brotherhood. I mean, in Swami Vivekananda, the book that I've just written, I mean, ultimately, the objective, why are we doing the book anyway? Because unfortunately, Vivekananda is not really remembered or taught in schools or colleges anymore in the way that he should be. It's not that he's forgotten, but I don't think that his ideologies have permeated into the huge, you know, uh, race, if I may use the word, that is called Gen Z today. And if you
Very nice.
huh, you give them Vivekananda, they are going to interpret him in a way, and I'm sure they are going to put it in practice. That is my responsibility, and that is where I'm going to bind them together.
Very
So
nice.
yes, and that is
So,
also power, Anupama. That is not a power shift actually. I mean, the power shift has caused us a lot of what should I say, loss, literary losses, because of the British rule to 200 years. But this is also a power shift in terms of, where we empower an entire new generation to read about a global icon. So, I mean, just make sure that when you're presenting Swamiji to them, make sure that you do it in a way that he's interpreted and seen as a global icon.
very nice. Very nice. So I think pretty much we have come to the end. If you all can answer in one or two words or sentences, this is a common question to you all. If the listeners of today leave today carrying just one idea about language, belonging, and cultural diversity, what do you hope that stays with them? Anita, you first, then Atima, then Debapriya. I think we've run very short of time, so I request you all to
So,
be
if
crisp.
we are talking about this particular discussion, I think the takeaway for readers and writers would be true to your heart, write what you really believe in. And if you're writing about a hen, don't dress it up as a turkey. All right. So write what you feel about, and the world is going to come and read what you write.
Wonderful. I love that. I'm a vegetarian, but I love the analogy of turkey. Yeah. Atima?
Yeah, I would think that as writers, we need to, stop being worried about whether the book is globally marketable, but we need to think about whether it's culturally authentic. Is it true to us? So I think that is what we need to take back from this whole discussion. Let's not bother too much about the commercial, the marketability. Of course, our publishers will not feel the same way, but that's a commercial reality which we all have to face. But I think we need to have that culturally authentic. We be culturally authentic as writers.
Wonderful. Debapriya?
Well, two
One word.
things, Anupama.
Yeah, yeah,
Well,
please.
see, number one is we should not ever try to give excuses for being true to our roots, because being culturally rooted is after all a good thing.
Very nice.
Right. And another thing is that we are, after all, we authors are an intellectual brotherhood or sisterhood. Right. So let's just perform our literary responsibilities. All right, and leave it to the reader to take it forward.
So nicely put. Authenticity, cultural authenticity, do your best, write the rest, and leave the rest to the destiny. Wow, I couldn't have summed it even better. Thank you for giving such wonderful answers. I hope the listeners will carry it, whatever we tried to share with you. Thank you, Sabine. Thank you, Ananke. Thank you, Readomania. It has been a wonderful evening.
And thank you,
Thank you.
Anupama, for being such a wonderful host. Thank you.
Absolutely, absolutely, Anupama.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Reader Media. Thank you, Anupama. Thank you, everybody, for this wonderful experience.